Welcome back to the studio. Let's take a look at leather marking tools. There's a couple cool things that you'll be able to learn by the end. First, we'll look at exactly what marking tools are used for. We'll take a look at some of the most effective and popular types. And then we'll share some tips to keep in mind when you're looking for or purchasing new marking tools for your shop. So with that, let's dive right in. A lot of leather working revolves around cutting and shaping leathers and different materials to make finished pieces. And that could be, things like belts. It could be accessories, watch bands, keychains, portfolios. Pretty much all types of leather goods usually have some type of marking and cutting involved. And so to do that, we use different tools to put those marks into the material and then help us throughout that creative process of cutting, assembling, and finishing our leather goods. And so there's a couple things that we could do to make that process easier. Across the types of tools that we'll be looking at, some are going to be relatively inexpensive in general, some a little more specialized. So it ultimately comes down to what you're trying to make and the types of tools that could be most helpful as you're trying to do that. Let's take a look first at our wing divider. And this is called a wing divider or a compass. And it's essentially going to be a metal, or it could be plastic or other device that has two arms that articulate and move, usually via a precise controlled wheel in the middle. So for example, this one has a mechanism where we turn it and it gets further and closer. So the idea there is that you get essentially a fixed distance from a point, and you can have relatively precise movements in there to get your size relatively exact. And so since it's joined at the top, you could also place this in a fixed position. For example, say we've got, this leather round, and we want to have a circle that's exactly, 1 inch from the center. So we could measure our center point. We could put this in it, make sure that our distance here is 1 inch apart, and then put it in there, and then move this around. I'll slide it over here. Essentially move this around. Let's push in that center point a little more, and then we could move this around and get a pretty nice circle right in there. And if you can kind of see, it's faint. There you go. Equidistant from the center. And so there are all different types of compasses out there like that. This also has articulating arms at the bottom. So you can go into all different types of specifics there. Adjustable ends for our fixed metal pieces. There are also, you can have marking pieces such as lead pencil or graphite, more nowadays. Or you could do double pin marks. So there's a lot of variations in the type that you could use, but essentially they are great for creating circular patterns that are very consistent and accurate for leather marking. Next, we have our corner tool. And so essentially this is going to be a stencil guide that you can use to make pretty precise corners in your leather work. I know, for example, if I'm working, you want to have, especially if you're doing like a wallet or something that is going to be a little more appreciated for its fit and finish, you want to make sure you get it right. And so if you're not, if you're using a die, it's going to cut your leather out perfect, no worries. But if you're doing more freehand work or smaller volume work, you can do corners like this with a stencil. And the stencil is going to come with different sized circles in there. You could look at the different sizing here, and you could choose the one that's going to fit your leather project the best. And essentially, you just kind of put it down, make sure you line it up properly on that corner, and that your material is aligned evenly. And then you could use something, like a pencil to put that mark in. And then now you have very faintly a cutting guide that you could use to come in with a knife and get a nice rounded corner. And that'll give you some consistency rather than freehanding it. And there are stencils out there in all kinds of shapes and sizes. Here's the round one because it's most relevant for cutting corners, but there's also square ones in pretty much any shape you can imagine. And so that is another way to help mark your leather, is by using something like a stencil. Next up is our Overstitch Wheel. And an overstitch wheel is a tool designed for essentially marking the stitch hole locations on your leather. It's comprised of a wheel with metal sharp points on the end that go around it, so it'll leave small indentations in the surface of the leather, leaving you an impression in that material and a guide that you could use later for using your pricking irons or your stitching chisels to put in those hole locations later on. It can also be used as a way to guide your sewing machine. If you do want to put in some markings and then file that as you sew, that's an option there as well. And they come in various pattern sizes. So if you want the hole markings further apart or closer together, you can get different sizings of that on the wheels. So keep an eye out for that. And they could also be used to go over the stitches once they're complete, gently pressing those stitches down to be a little closer to that leather surface and less exposed to wear and tear from daily use. Some overstitch wheels come with a fence, and this is an additional metal piece that attaches, allowing for a variable distance to be set from the edge, so you get more consistency in the lines and markings that you're making. Another famous one is the pricking wheel. So this tool is designed for marking stitch hole locations on leather as well. It's comprised of a wheel with very sharp metal points that go all around it. And it's similar to an overstitch wheel, but the pricking wheel generally has sharper points that penetrate the leather more deeply. So whereas the overstitch wheel is meant to mark hole locations, the pricking wheel is generally meant to actually penetrate through that leather and make holes in thinner leather material. Surely, you could use it on thicker leathers to just mark hole locations as well, and then follow that up with stitching chisels or irons, or even using an awl. So it's up to you depending on the exact way it's used and the leather thickness that you're working with. Though on thinner leathers, it can be used to both mark and create those holes for you. So when you're working on smaller items, these can come in handy, and that way you get some pretty easy location markings for your work. And additionally, some of these come with a fence as well, so it can separate where those marks are being made at a consistent distance from the edge of the leather, and that way you've got a straight line down the entire edge of whatever you're working with. The leather stippler. So this is kind of like a borderline marking tool. It's more of a decorative piece, but can also be used for marking depending on what you're trying to do or if you're in a pinch. And essentially it's a tool with these sharp metal grouping of pins on the end. And so what you can do with it, see if we can get that, there we go. And so you could use that by essentially tapping this into a piece of leather and leaving some marks behind it. So for example, let's just mark this right here. We'll take our, actually let me get a better angle, put that down. We'll be using our maul to strike the top, and because of the nylon here and the wood here, it'll generally keep both relatively in good shape. So we put that down there and then just hit that. And you can see it leaves a little stippling pattern in there. So again, it's more decorative, though in a pinch, if you're trying to mark leather that you're going to be using for cutting on a broad scale, the stippler is something that can work. And one of my favorites is the awl. So this is just a very basic, round pointed awl. And what I really like about it is it becomes a universal tool for just like marking and scraping. So for example, we have this piece of leather. Say we were measuring, we wanted to be a certain distance in. What we could do is just take, there we go. We can measure from the edge, and then wherever that point is, just take this and push it in. And you can see right here, it creates a little mark, and I'll do that on this empty end over here. And there you can see a mark, and that becomes great. Like if you're cutting and you're going to be cutting inside that marking point, this becomes a really easy way to mark your leather because it just goes right in there wherever you're working. It could also be really good to scratch too. If you wanted to basically scratch a cut line, you set up your line like that, and you can just draw this awl across your leather surface. It's going to create a line right in there. And then you could use that for your cutting line as well, or any number of things on the leather. So I really love the awl because it's relatively universal in terms of marking, putting down points and a whole lot of other things. You could even, if you want, use it as a pencil, and you could write things, like, hey, 1/4 or whatever you're looking to note on your leather. even if you're out of paper and you have a scrap piece of leather, you could use this and write on it. So this is a phenomenal tool, relatively inexpensive, and there's so many uses for it in leatherworking. Next up is the pencil. That's right, the most basic graphite pencil. I'm sure you could imagine. All you do, you could use it for marking locations, you could use it for writing on it, and basically any kind of thing that you need. And there you go. So pretty self-explanatory, but a pencil will leave that graphite on there that can easily be erased later. If you're not pressing too hard. If you are pressing hard, it will leave some imprint into that surface. But as easy and classic as they come, the pencil is a great leather marking tool. You could use it to mark holes for punching, use it to mark corners for cutting, and whatever you need, kind of along that way. Another option is the leather stylus. So a stylus is a tool that has a metal end on it that's rounded, and typically used for tooling and carving to put designs in the leather. It can equally be used as a method to mark your leather. So say you wanted to put a hole location here, like for example, we were going to be putting hole marks for our belt project. So what we'd do is we'd just determine where we're going to place them, and then we could just use the stylus to leave those hole locations there. And then if you look, there they are. We could use that then to put our hole punch over them and kind of make those holes. Additionally, just like with the awl, you can use the stylus to put patterns on a material. You want to put lines in there, things like that. So it becomes another relatively universal tool, and there's all kinds of stylus tips available, like in terms of the actual ends on them. So like this one is going to be a little more pointed, this one's going to be a little more rounded. So there's all kinds that are available based on what you're trying to do and what can help you the most. So keep in mind, a stylus can be a great leather marking tool. And lastly, one of my favorites, the knife. So I found working with leather, it's very easy to use the blade. Here's a regular hobby knife. I think this is an X-Acto one. There are different brands out there. Pretty much any knife you're working with, you can use to mark your leather. And so what I'll use it for is sometimes if I want to mark a hole location, like for example, we want to put holes in here, I'll just use the tip of the blade essentially as a little marking point. Give it a little turn, give it a little turn, like that. And when you see, you've got these really, really fine holes, and they're almost like imperceptible here. So depending on if you want to go deeper or if you're going to be cutting that piece off, it's a way that you can almost put little holes in things that you won't see as easily, which can be good if it may be in something, it's going to be a final product, or if you want to go a little deeper, you just kind of course, push a little harder, and there's your hole. Additionally, with that, if you cut very lightly, it can also be a line marker. See, we're leaving a fine line in there. There we go. Then we cut. So again, it's another one of those general tools that while its primary function, of course, is cutting, it can also be used for marking depending on what you're making and how it might work. And one more, the ruler. We focus primarily on tools that leave marks. However, this is obviously an essential piece as it helps us to make those marks. And so if you're looking to put equidistant marks on a piece of leather or a straight line, a ruler is going to be great. I like this. It's also called a safety cutting ruler because on the one hand, you have this nice rubber padded bottom and they're even steel, so it sits flat on the desk or your work surface to get a nice straight line. Also, if you're cutting with a knife, on a typical ruler, what may happen is if you're cutting and your ruler jumps this metal as you're cutting, what it runs into is potentially your hand. And so if you're paying attention, it's usually fine. You can, keep things going smoothly. However, this safety ruler has an added mechanism where this ruler part, see if I could show it, it pops up. And when that flips up, it creates this channel behind the cutting edge where you can put your fingers. And so those fingers can now sit behind it. And while you're cutting or doing any kind of work in front, you've got this shield that's going to protect if anything jumps up and off. So if you look at it, your fingers are behind this shield while the blade is on this side. So again, not necessary, though if you're doing work pretty quickly or if you want to just have that extra layer of protection, a safety ruler can be pretty awesome when you're doing your leather marking. A few tips to keep in mind when you're purchasing items to mark your leather with. You're going to look for things that doesn't have to be expensive. Just make sure if you are using a tool that's going to be sharp, make sure it's well cared for and sharp. If you're using something that's like a stylus that's intended to be dull, just make sure it's clean, while you're working on it. And for certain tools, it's worth investing in. Others, it may not be as critical. Something like a stylus, it's going to be essentially a hardened piece of metal. And so there's not going to be huge amounts of differences in them. If you are working to get an awl, you do want an awl that's going to maintain its shape and sharpness if it's going to be a sharp one. So you're going to want to look a little more there. If you are using pencils, find a quality graphite, and that way it'll be easier to see when it's on there, and likely also easier to remove if you need to remove it as part of your design process. If you are looking for a compass, you could find one that's just a very simple one, or one with articulating arms based on the size of circles you're trying to make. And for any kind of knives you're going to be using, make sure they just stay sharp, and that way your marks are going to be clean and predictable wherever you want to put them. And so with that, there you have it. Those are our leather marking tools. And if you have any questions, let us know. If you have experience or other tips to add, we'd love to hear them, so share those with us. And until next time, keep crafting.